in September of 2011. My wife Laura and I had just put our two daughters down for bed. Talia was 3 and Olivia was 9 months old. And for those parents in the audience, you know what a wonderful moment of peace that can be. We settled downstairs when we heard 3 guttural, bad cries from upstairs. We looked at each other and we rushed up the steps, literally stumbling over each other as we ran up the steps. We burst into their room and we noticed Olivia, my 9-month-old, convulsing. I scooped her out of the crib and my 3-year-old popped out of her bed and started to cry. My wife looked at me, and in fact, my wife started to cry as well. I looked down at Olivia and she had lost all of her color. There was nothing. Her eyes were rolled in the back of her head. Her skin was absolutely on fire, and I had no idea what to do. I'm looking at her and I was trying to get something from her. I was trying to feel a pulse. I felt no pulse. I didn't feel her breathing. I felt no air coming from her whatsoever. And I had this moment of clarity. And the reason why I say clarity is because as I looked at my 3-year-old and I looked at my wife crying, I felt the urge in myself to cry. And I realized at that moment that my 9-month-old was going to die. And I needed to leave the room. I decided that I would leave the house because if she was going to die, she was going to die in her daddy's arms, and I was going to be there with her holding her. So I rushed downstairs, I told my wife to call 911, and I decided that I would meet the EMT workers out on the street. And I'm holding her and I'm outside and I'm like, Livy Bear, Daddy's here. It's okay, Daddy's here. The EMT workers eventually showed up. They brought her into the house, they took her vital signs and they gave her oxygen, and her color started to come back. And she started to come to, her eyes were normal, she was looking around the room. She started to calm down, and I started to calm down, and we realized that everything was going to be okay. And I looked down at myself and I realized that I had actually sweat through all of my clothing. My shirt was soaked, my pants were soaked, and in a moment of levity, one of the police officers in our home looked at me and said, "Sir, we only have enough oxygen for your daughter. Please calm down." In the following days, we got back to our normal routine, relaxed, and realized what we had just been through. And while passively enjoying my day, I noticed that there was a memorial service because it was the 10-year anniversary for September 11th, and I heard a name. They called out the name Sean Lugano. Sean was the rugby captain at Loyola University where I'd gone to college. He was my rugby captain. And when I heard his name, I paused and I sat. And while it was difficult losing Sean on September 11th, hearing his name called 10 years later was so profound that I found myself weeping. Because I was angry and I was upset. I was angry that he was gone and he was murdered that day, but I was upset the fact that I had a lovely life, a phenomenal wife, 2 beautiful children, and a wonderful home, and Sean would never have an opportunity to experience that. And what I did next was profound. What I did next was I chose to be vulnerable and to communicate those feelings to the world. So I wrote an article about Sean, my experience with my daughter Olivia, and it was terrifying to put that into the world. And what happened next changed me. There was a kickback of warmth and love and affection and support, people talking about my friend Sean, people offering their love and support to Olivia, and I was shocked by it. It was like this warm blanket of beautiful interaction from friends, family, individuals that I hadn't heard from in years. And what I realized that day and what I learned was that vulnerability works. Yet we're all so afraid to pull away these masks. I would argue that the mechanisms that we engage to allow ourselves to not be vulnerable, in fact, hurt us as opposed to help us. In July of 2009, I was fired. Now, I'm not the first guy to get fired. I'm not the last guy to get fired. But this was a particularly mortifying event for me because leading up to that, firing, I had actually lost 2 other jobs prior to it. So this was the 3rd time I was being fired in 2 short years. And this job in particular was my dream job. And I had let everybody in my network, my family, my friends, know that I wanted to work in social media and I wanted to be at Buddy Media. I was so passionate about getting into social media, in fact, that I had even purchased the URL facebookshouldhireme.com. Facebook didn't hire me. Whatever, Mark Zuckerberg, your loss. But I got a job at this company, Buddy Media. I was so oblivious to what was happening that day that morning I actually saw the CEO and said good morning to him. I was in a great mood. I just signed a non-disclosure agreement for a big deal, and I got called into his office, which wasn't unusual. I sat down at his desk, and there were two other executives there. I was like a puppy. I had a big smile on my face. Hey, guys. And I said, Chris, today is your last day at Buddy Media. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. I realized in hindsight that in fact I was having a panic attack. While it looked like my body was slowing down and nothing was functioning, in fact it was the opposite in my brain. In my brain, I was moving 1,000,000 miles an hour. In my brain, I was thinking about the conversation that I was going to have with my wife because she was pregnant with Olivia, who had yet to be born, and how that was going to affect her health. And in my brain, I was thinking about how I was going to communicate to all my friends and family, whom I had told so enthusiastically and excitedly that I was working at Buddy Media and I was finally in social media and living my dream and following my passion. And I felt waves of deep, ugly humiliation come over me. And not being able to say a word, I stood up, shook the hand of the CEO, and walked out of the office. Standing outside with the box in my hand, I felt like I was not enough. I felt like I had dedicated everything, my heart, my soul, my life, my passion to this job, and I had just gotten fired. And in the weeks and months following that being fired, I used softer language. I would never say fired. I would say I got laid off. I got let go. They were downsizing. I would never allow myself to follow my truth and to articulate the fact that no, in fact, I had been fired. And in the following months, weeks, and years, I had to proactively call myself out and attempt to be as vulnerable as possible. And I did it in myriad ways. I blogged about it, I wrote articles about it, I even wrote about it in my book. And I finally came out the other end, and I saw a kickback of warmth and love and affection from other executives and individuals that had gotten fired themselves and were thanking me for being brave enough to talk about getting fired. And were thanking me for saying, raising my hand and not sugarcoating it and talking about my truest moment. And again, I realized that vulnerability works, yet we are so afraid to remove these masks. And again, I would argue that the mechanisms that we engage to protect ourselves from being vulnerable, in fact, hurt us. Now, here are some ways that we can execute vulnerability in our own lives. With our family, perhaps with our family, we put away our devices and we give our individual family members undivided attention. At work, perhaps we offer praise to individuals that are doing great, or maybe we even help somebody that might potentially be viewed as a competitor. Or we might be truly vulnerable at work and actually ask for help. With our friends, perhaps there's somebody that we haven't spoken to in a few years or haven't reconnected, but to be vulnerable enough to extend that olive branch and be the bigger, better person in that situation, or in our relationships, and perhaps to allow ourselves to not win every single argument, and to be vulnerable in that way. Because vulnerability works, yet we are so afraid to take away those masks. In 2010, my father was diagnosed with a disease called ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, and some of you may have heard of it because of the Ice Bucket Challenge. Now, while on television or on social media it might seem like a light and fluffy disease, in reality it is brutal. It is a neurological disease that absolutely destroys your body, but you are aware of everything that is happening around you as your body deteriorates. It's torture. By 2012, my father was already in a wheelchair and leveraging breathing apparatus to keep him alive. He couldn't breathe on his own, he could barely move his arms on his own, and had to sit back in the electrical wheelchair to relax and move his body around because he couldn't stretch. Can you imagine that? You can't stand up and you can't stretch. And the only way that I could offer any sort of help to my father that I could possibly think of was to run a marathon to raise money and awareness for the ALS Association in 2012. So I went about being a type A personality. I broke out my spreadsheet. I'm not a runner at all. I'd never run more than 2 miles, perhaps, in my entire life. I got out the spreadsheet, I figured out how I was going to run every day, and I stuck to my training. And at the end of 8 months, I was ready to run this marathon. I was fit, I was battling through injury, but it was ugly, such a bad runner. The day of the marathon starts to approach, and I'm really excited about it. But if you recall, in the 2012 New York City Marathon, that's when Hurricane Sandy hit. And unfortunately, they canceled the marathon. Now, in an odd twist of events, my entire family was actually underneath my parents' roof that day, because when Sandy hit, we lost power, and we all went up to my parents' place because my father had a backup generator in order to keep him alive because of his breathing apparatus. So we had spent a few days together leading up to the marathon being canceled. And it was nice. My brother was there with his wife and his kids, and my wife and my kids were there. My cousin was there, and we was, kind of huddled down. And I'm still thinking that I'm going to run the marathon. I'm ready to go. I brought all my things to run the marathon. We finally get the notification, sorry, the marathon's canceled. I don't know what to do here. Pour a glass of scotch for myself, pour a glass of scotch for my father. We sit down, cheers. Daddy, I'm sorry. I can't run this marathon for you. We have a couple of drinks together. I ate an entire slip of Oreo cookies. It's fantastic. I went to bed that night at my parents' house again, and I wake up in the morning, and I'm showering, a little hungover from the scotch, and I think to myself, I'm going to run anyway. I've trained for this marathon. I've put my body through all of this. And in fact, I'd raised $3,000 from friends and family and colleagues to donate to the ALS Association. I have an obligation here. So I tell my wife that I'm going to set out. We're going to start in my town. I'm going to meander around. I pick out my route. We drive around and we stash water for me. And I know that I'm going to run about this time. And I understood how long it was going to take me to run the marathon. And I said, I'm going to finish at this high school track, and it's going to be fantastic. This is around the time that I'm going to finish. We could tell Dad, and Dad will be there. And I go on my run. I get to the high school track, and I just start looping the track. I'm realizing I might have gotten to the track a little bit earlier. I should have stayed on the other roads, because now I'm really bored and I'm just running in circles. And I look like an oddball because I'm wearing my ALS Run for a Cure red shirt as kids' soccer games are starting to pop up on the field. And parents are looking at me and they're like, what is this guy doing, just running in circles? And I spot somebody that I would encounter while I was training. And she spots me, and she knows that the marathon had been canceled. She says, I'm sorry, the marathon was canceled. And I'm running, and I say, I'm doing it now. She peels off, and she starts to tell the parents and the kids what I'm doing as I'm running around the track. And at about mile 17, somebody comes up next to me. It's one of the dads of one of the kids, and he says, I used to run distance at Binghamton. You mind if I join you? So he starts running with me. Wonderful act of support and love and friendship. And as the soccer games end, my brother said it was like Rocky, the kids start to run behind me and they're like, he's running for a cure, keep going, keep going. And I'm like, that's great, but you give me a shot of adrenaline. I still got a couple of miles to go. Relax, relax, this is crazy. So I'm running around. I finally get to the last mile. My brother runs over to me. He's like, when is this gonna end? What's going on here? They're waiting. All right, I'm trying to finish. And as I turn the corner of the final lap on the track, I see my father. And I also saw my daughters run to me. I scooped them up, and I noticed that my nieces and nephews have set up a finish line for me. And the referee stopped the soccer game that was playing. And the girls line up on the side as I finish to cheer me on, to finish my marathon. I run across the finish line with my daughters in my arms, and there was like 25 people there. This was not a lot of people, but man, to me, it felt like there was a stadium of 75,000 people cheering for me. And I cross the finish line, and I bend down to my father. And we both start weeping in each other's arms. And I mean weeping. And prior to that moment, I had only seen my father cry once before. Only once. And how silly is that? That it took me all of those years and running a marathon to articulate to my father how much I was hurting watching him suffer. This speech is a lesson for my girls, for my daughters, so that they don't ever have to run a marathon or do something crazy like that to articulate to me how much they love me. Because vulnerability works. We've all had moments of self-doubt, like when I had Olivia in my arms and I didn't know what to do. We've all had moments of difficulty, like when I was fired 3 times in 2 years. And we've all had moments of loss when my father eventually passed away from ALS. It is the most appropriate connection that we have with each other as human beings. Yet we pretend to be completely and utterly infallible in public. Let's get better at telling our truest and most vulnerable stories, and let's love and support each other through it. Thank you.